There was a night many years ago when I sat across from a man who had failed 17 times, not in small matters, in everything that mattered to him. His business had collapsed. His marriage had ended. His health had betrayed him at the worst possible moment. And yet, when I looked into his eyes that evening, I saw something I had not expected to find. I saw fire, not the loud theatrical fire of the desperate man, but the quiet, steady flame of one who had finally understood something the rest of the world had missed. He looked at me and said, almost in a whisper, "Mr. Hill, I think I have finally learned how to keep going." And in that moment, I realized I was sitting across from a man who was about to become unstoppable. I have spent more than 20 years of my life studying the lives of the most extraordinary achievers this nation has ever produced. I walked through the libraries of Andrew Carnegie. I sat in the workshops of Thomas Edison. I watched Henry Ford turn a wooden shed into an empire that reshaped the modern world. And in every one of these men, in every one of these lives, I found a single thread that bound them together more tightly than wealth, more tightly than intelligence, more tightly than fortune itself. That thread was persistence. But it was not the persistence the world speaks of. It was something deeper, something almost secret. The world has misunderstood persistence for a very long time. People have confused it with stubbornness. They have confused it with effort. They have confused it with the noisy, sweating, exhausting struggle of those who push against life until life finally pushes back and breaks them. But true persistence, the persistence of the great achievers, is not exhaustion. It is not desperation. It is not the gritted teeth of a man holding on by his fingernails. It is something quieter, something more lawful, something almost mystical in its operation. And tonight I want to share with you the 7 laws of persistence that most people never learn. The 7 laws that separated the men I studied from the millions who lived and died in obscurity. The 7 laws that, once understood, will make quitting almost impossible for the soul that grasps them. Before I begin, I must tell you something. What you are about to hear is not motivation. I have no interest in motivating you tonight. Motivation is the cheap currency of the weak. It runs out the moment the speaker leaves the room. What I am offering you is something else entirely. I am offering you a map of the inner territory where persistence is not a feeling but a structure, a map drawn from the lives of men who refused to fail in a world that was determined to defeat them. And the most surprising part of this map is hidden right where most people refuse to look. The first law of persistence. I learned not from a millionaire, but from a man who had nothing. He was a small farmer in the hills of Virginia, and he had spent 40 years cultivating a piece of land that most men would have abandoned in the first season. When I asked him how he had endured, he gave me an answer I have never forgotten. He said, "I never started anything I was not prepared to finish." That sentence contained the first and perhaps the most important law of persistence I have ever recorded. It is this: persistence begins not in the moment of struggle, but in the moment of decision. The man who decides weakly will persist weakly. The man who decides with the full force of his being will persist with the full force of his being. Most people do not fail because they lack endurance. They fail because their original decision was never strong enough to require endurance. They drifted into their goals. They wandered into their ambitions. They picked up their dreams the way a man picks up a stone on the road, casually without commitment, ready to drop it the moment it becomes heavy. And of course they drop it. The stone was never theirs to begin with. I called this principle the law of definite decision, and it is the foundation upon which all persistence rests. Without it, every other law collapses. With it, every other law becomes natural, almost effortless. When a man decides, truly decides, that a particular outcome is non-negotiable, his subconscious mind begins to organize itself around that decision. Obstacles that once seemed insurmountable begin to appear as mere puzzles. Failures that once would have ended him become information. The definite major purpose he has chosen becomes a magnetic field, drawing toward him the people, the ideas, the opportunities that align with his chosen direction. But the detail most people overlook is hidden right here. The decision must be made before the difficulty arrives, not during it. A man who waits until the storm to decide whether he will stand has already been blown away. The decision must be made in the calm so that it can hold in the storm. The second law came to me through the life of Thomas Edison, a man whose persistence has been celebrated so often that the world has forgotten what made it remarkable. Everyone knows the story of his 10,000 attempts before he produced a working incandescent lamp, but almost no one understands what was happening inside him during those 10,000 attempts. I asked him once, in a quiet moment in his Menlo Park laboratory, how he had endured the repeated failure. He looked at me with that calm, almost amused expression he wore so often, and he said, "Mr. Hill, I have not failed. I have simply found 10,000 ways that will not work." And in that sentence, I discovered the second law of persistence, the law of reframed defeat. The men and women who persist are not those who experience less failure than others. They are those who interpret failure differently. Where the ordinary man sees defeat as a verdict, the extraordinary man sees defeat as data. Where the ordinary man feels shame in setback, the extraordinary man feels curiosity. Where the ordinary man retreats into self-pity, the extraordinary man advances into analysis. This is not a trick of optimism. It is not a positive thinking exercise. It is a fundamental rewiring of the relationship between the self and the obstacle. And here begins the darkest game of the subconscious mind. For if you do not consciously choose how to interpret your defeats, your subconscious will choose for you, and it will almost always choose poorly. The subconscious mind, left untrained, is a coward. It will protect you from further pain by convincing you to stop trying. It will whisper that you were never meant for this. It will dress your retreat in the costume of wisdom and call it acceptance. The man who persists is the man who has trained his subconscious to interpret defeat as instruction rather than indictment. I have watched this law operate in the lives of hundreds of successful men, and I have watched its absence destroy thousands of talented ones. There was a young inventor I met in Pittsburgh whose mind was, by every measure I could apply, more brilliant than Edison's. His ideas were original. His technical skill was extraordinary. His vision for the future of electricity was, in some ways, ahead of its time. But he had never learned the second law. Each failure landed on him like a personal accusation. Each setback confirmed a story he had been telling himself since childhood, that he was not quite good enough, that success belonged to others, that something in him was fundamentally flawed. And so, after a handful of disappointments that Edison would have absorbed in a single afternoon, this brilliant young man closed his workshop, took a position as a clerk, and lived out his days in quiet, unremarkable competence. The world never heard his name, not because he lacked ability, but because he had never learned to refuse the meaning his subconscious assigned to his struggles. The third law revealed itself to me through the life of Andrew Carnegie, the man whose suggestion first set me on this 20-year path of inquiry. Carnegie was, in many ways, the architect of modern American industry, but what fascinated me about him was not his wealth. It was the strange, almost stubborn refusal he had to ever face a difficulty alone. He surrounded himself deliberately and systematically with a circle of minds whose combined energy created something larger than the sum of its parts. He called this circle his cabinet. I would later give it a name that has since traveled around the world. I called it the Mastermind. And the third law of persistence is this: no man persists alone for long. The lone wolf is a poetic image, but it is a lie. The men who endure are the men who have woven around themselves a network of allies whose presence makes quitting embarrassing. You see, the human will is a magnificent thing, but it is not infinite. There are days when the will fails. There are nights when the fire in the soul burns low. There are seasons when the path becomes so dark that the inner compass begins to spin. In those moments, the man who has built no mastermind around him will quit. He will quit quietly, without fanfare, and he will tell himself it was the only sensible thing to do. But the man who has surrounded himself with a circle of committed minds, minds that share his definite purpose, minds that have witnessed his commitment, minds that will refuse to let him retreat into mediocrity, that man cannot quit. He is held in place by a structure larger than his individual will. The mastermind is not merely a network of advisors. It is a magnetic field of accountability that makes persistence almost involuntary. What Hill said about this subject is deeply unsettling, and I will say it again here in plain words. Most of the people you spend your time with are quietly programming you to fail, not maliciously, not consciously, but by the slow, steady drip of their own resignation, their own small ambitions, their own unspoken belief that the world is a place where great things do not happen to people like them. Persistence cannot survive that environment for long. The fourth law of persistence, then, is closely related to the third, but it operates in the opposite direction. It is the law of environmental engineering. The men I studied did not merely build masterminds of allies. They actively, ruthlessly, almost surgically removed from their lives the influences that would have undermined their persistence. They guarded their attention. They guarded their conversations. They guarded the books they read and the voices they listened to in the quiet hours of the morning, when the subconscious mind is most receptive to suggestion. I remember a conversation with Henry Ford on this very subject. He told me, with that direct, almost severe manner of his, that he had long ago learned to be careful about whose words he allowed into his mind. He said that every conversation was either an investment or a withdrawal, and that most men were unconsciously withdrawing from their own potential every day by listening to the wrong voices. He had structured his entire life, his office, his home, his recreations, his correspondences, around the principle that his subconscious mind was a garden, and that he alone was responsible for what was planted in it. The result was a persistence that astonished his contemporaries. While other industrialists rose and fell with the moods of the market, Ford simply continued. He continued through the panics. He continued through the wars. He continued through the personal tragedies that would have shattered a less guarded soul. And he continued because he had refused year after year to allow the seeds of doubt to be planted in the soil of his subconscious mind. The fifth law of persistence is one that took me longer to understand than any of the others, because it operates in a region of the mind that most people refuse to acknowledge exists. I am speaking of the law of faith, not religious faith, though it includes that for those whose temperament leans in that direction. I am speaking of something more fundamental, a trained, disciplined, almost scientific certainty in the eventual realization of one's definite major purpose. The men who persisted longest were the men whose faith in the outcome was so complete that the obstacles in front of them lost their power to discourage. They did not hope they would succeed. They knew, and they knew not because they had received some external guarantee, but because they had cultivated, through autosuggestion and disciplined imagination, an inner conviction that bordered on the unshakable. This is the part of persistence that the modern world has almost entirely forgotten. We live in an age that worships doubt and calls it sophistication. We have been taught that certainty is the mark of the fool, and that the wise man hedges, qualifies, hesitates. But I have watched too many men accomplish too many extraordinary things to believe this fashionable nonsense. The great achievers were not the most doubtful men of their generation. They were the most certain, and their certainty was not naive. It was forged. It was built brick by brick through a daily practice of impressing upon the subconscious mind the image of the desired outcome until that image became more real to them than the apparent obstacles in their path. This is what I called autosuggestion, and it is the engine by which faith is constructed in the laboratory of the mind. What the lives of great achievers have been trying to tell us for centuries is that the inner image precedes the outer reality. The man who holds day after day the vivid mental picture of his definite major purpose, who feels its emotional reality, who believes in its eventual manifestation with the same certainty with which he believes in tomorrow's sunrise, that man has set in motion forces that the cynical world cannot perceive but cannot prevent. His persistence becomes effortless because he is no longer trying to push a boulder up a hill. He is walking toward an outcome he has already, in the deepest chamber of his mind, accepted as inevitable. The struggle that exhausts the doubter does not exhaust him because he is not, in his own experience, struggling. He is arriving. The sixth law of persistence may be the most paradoxical of them all, and I want to introduce it carefully because the modern mind tends to misunderstand it the moment it is mentioned. I call it the law of pleasant pain. The men I studied did not persist because they had eliminated discomfort from their pursuit. They persisted because they had developed a peculiar, almost intimate relationship with discomfort. They had learned to find within the struggle itself a satisfaction that the comfortable man never tastes. The real turning point begins here, in the moment when the seeker stops trying to escape the difficulty of the path and begins to recognize the difficulty as the path. I once spent an evening with a man who had built one of the largest steel operations in the country. His hands, even in his 60s, still carried the calluses of his early years in the mills. I asked him whether, looking back, he wished the journey had been easier. He laughed at me. He actually laughed. And then he said something I have remembered ever since. He said, "Mr. Hill, the easy version of my life would have killed the man I became. The struggle was not the price of who I am. The struggle was the maker of who I am." That sentence reorganized something in my understanding of persistence. The men who endured longest were not the men who minded discomfort least. They were the men who had learned to extract meaning from discomfort, to find within the burn of effort a confirmation of their own becoming. They did not persist despite the difficulty. They persisted because the difficulty was, in some deep sense, what they had come for. This is the secret that the cult of comfort cannot understand. Modern man has been sold a vision of the good life in which all friction is removed, all effort minimized, all discomfort outsourced or anesthetized. And the result is a generation that cannot persist at anything for very long, because it has never learned that the soul is built precisely in the places where comfort is absent. The men I studied had, almost without exception, embraced a kind of voluntary hardship as a feature of their character. They rose early, not because they had to, but because they had learned what the early hours did for the mind. They worked long, not because they were driven by fear, but because they had discovered the strange contentment of sustained effort directed toward a meaningful end. They had developed, in short, the capacity to enjoy the very thing that breaks ordinary men. And now we come to the seventh law, the law that contains, in some sense, all the others, the law that I considered most carefully before deciding to share it with you tonight. I call it the law of continued becoming, and it is this: persistence in its highest form is not the act of pushing through obstacles toward a goal. It is the act of becoming the kind of person for whom the goal is the natural expression of who they have become. The men I studied were not, at the end of their long climbs, the same men who had begun those climbs. The climb had transformed them, and it had transformed them precisely because they had refused to quit the climb. The persistence and the transformation were not two separate things. They were the same thing, viewed from different angles. This is what almost no one understands about the great achievers. They did not persist in order to reach a destination. They persisted because they had discovered, somewhere along the way, that the persistence itself was changing them into the person who could hold the destination once it was reached. The wealth that Carnegie built was not separable from the man Carnegie became. The empire that Ford constructed was not separable from the inner empire he had constructed within himself first. The 1,000 failures that Edison absorbed were not obstacles between him and his inventions. They were the very furnace in which the inventor was being forged. And the inventions, when they finally came as the natural expression of a man who had become, through years of disciplined struggle, the kind of being from whom such inventions naturally flow. Here, then, is the deepest paradox of persistence, and the one I want you to carry with you tonight. The man who persists for the sake of the prize will eventually quit, because the prize will always seem too far away on the days when his will is weak. But the man who persists because he has fallen in love with who he is becoming through the persistence, that man is unstoppable, because he is no longer trying to reach somewhere. He is already, in every moment of his effort, where he most wants to be. He is in the act of becoming himself. I have watched this transformation happen in men I had given up on. I have watched it fail to happen in men I had every reason to believe would succeed. and I have come to a conclusion that I will share with you now plainly without dressing it up. The 7 laws of persistence are not techniques. They are not strategies. They are not tools you pick up when you need them and put down when you do not. They are descriptions of an inner architecture that, once built, makes quitting almost impossible. The definite decision, the reframed defeat, the mastermind, the engineered environment, the cultivated faith, the pleasant pain, the continued becoming. Each one is a wall and a structure. And when the structure is complete, the man inside it is no longer fighting to persist. He simply persists, the way a river simply flows, because that is what he has become. I want to leave you tonight with a question, not an answer. The answer is something only you can construct in the quiet chambers of your own mind, in the disciplined hours of your own practice. The question is this: of the 7 laws I have shared with you, which one is missing from your own architecture? Where is the wall that has not yet been built? Where is the gap through which your persistence is leaking out of your life, drop by drop, day by day, year by year? Because I have observed in the long study of human achievement that most men do not fail for lack of all 7 laws. They fail for lack of one missing wall, one unguarded gate, one law they had never been taught to see. Find it, build it. And then, when the next storm comes, and it will come because the storms always come, you will discover something that the millions of quiet quitters never discover. You will discover that persistence, when it is properly built, is not a burden you carry. It is a structure that carries you. And inside that structure, you will not be the man who endured. You will be the man who became. And the world in time will know the difference. The hour grows late, and I have said what I came to say. But before I close, I want to remind you of something I told that man with the 17 failures on that long ago evening when I first began to understand what I have shared with you tonight. I told him that the laws of persistence had been working in his life all along, but in reverse. He had been persistent in his doubts. He had been persistent in his self-criticism. He had been persistent in the small, quiet beliefs that had kept him in the same place for 40 years. The question was never whether he could learn to persist. He had already mastered persistence. The question was only whether he would now turn that mastered persistence in a new direction toward something worthy of him. I will leave you with the same question. You are already, whether you realize it or not, a master of persistence. The only question is what you have been persisting in, and whether, beginning tonight, you will choose to persist in something else. When was the last time you truly listened to the voice of your own definite purpose? When was the last time you sat in silence long enough to hear, beneath the noise of the world, the quiet, patient voice of the self you were meant to become? That voice has been waiting for you. It has been waiting longer than you know. And if you will give it your attention tonight, even for a moment, you may find that it has been trying to tell you all along exactly which of the 7 laws is the one you most need to learn. That, my friend, is where the real work begins.